This is another one of our conventions small group coaching sessions. And this time, I want to focus on some techniques that you can use to write more complex sentences. I want you to become sophisticated communicators. And one of the ways that you do that is by communicating more than one idea in a single sentence without making it a run-on sentence. So I'm going to show you two strategies today that you can do that. One strategy is called an appositive, and that's what I'm going to start with. An appositive is a noun or a phrase that renames another noun right beside it. Now, that might sound redundant, but in fact, what you're doing is you're squeezing in a little extra information about the noun, oftentimes a person or a place, squeezing in a little bit of extra information so you can create a more complex sentence that communicates multiple ideas, but it's still punctuated correctly. So what I've got here are three examples from the novels that we're reading and the short story that I used as a mentor text. I've put the appositive phrase in green and bold, but I want you to notice where the commas go. Anytime you use an appositive phrase, you can see that we have sandwiched it between two commas. You always set off the appositive phrase with commas on either side. Sometimes I've seen students do parentheses. I think because their intuition, their gut is telling them that it's like a little side comment where we're squeezing in some information. And you're totally right, that's what it is. But the proper way to punctuate it is with commas, not with parentheses. So let's take a look at the first example. Señora Inés, Luciana's mother, puts Rosara to work right away. You can even hear in my tone of voice how I read that was like it was like a little side comment where I'm just quickly explaining who Señora Inés is. This strategy of an appositive is an excellent way to introduce a character in your novel when you're writing about them in your essay. Because remember, we can't assume that the reader of your essay has read the book. So you need to explain, anytime you mention a character for the first time, you need to explain who they are and what their connection is to the story. So let's take a look at the second bullet point. If you're going to describe or discuss Asher in your essay about the giver, you got to identify who he is, like I did here. Asher, Jonas's best friend, was often breaking minor rules in the community. So let me point out in my little note that I put over here in the margin that if I didn't use an appositive phrase and instead I wrote these as two separate sentences, they would be short, choppy, and simple. They would only communicate one idea per sentence, and it would sound something like, Señora Inés is Lucinda's mother. She puts Rosara to work right away. That kind of writing is technically accurate. It's not wrong. It just becomes very choppy and repetitive, and it creates this beat, this rhythm that is not exciting. It's not engaging. It's monotonous. So we want to try to write more complex sentences where we use appositive phrases in between commas to add explanation of who that person is that you just mentioned, or what's some more important information about that place that you just mentioned, or what's some important explanation about that item or thing you just mentioned, or that job you just mentioned, something like that. All right, so appositives are one way to write more complex sentences. Now I want to show you a second strategy you can use, and that is including dependent clauses. So I'm going to come down here and show you what I'm talking about there. We talked about this, and I want to make sure that you understand what a dependent clause is, and that there is also such a thing as an independent clause. So a dependent clause is a clause that has a subject and a verb. The subject is who or what is doing the verb in any sentence or clause. So they have both a verb and they have something or someone doing the verb, but what makes it dependent is that it cannot stand alone by itself as a sentence and make sense. It needs the independent clause to go with it to complete the thought. So let's take a look at three sentences down here. I have put the dependent clause in purple. Read the first one with me and you'll see it's not a complete sentence. It can't stand by itself. Because she wanted to believe that she belonged, I could not put a period at the end of that. It does not make sense by itself. It's incomplete. It's dependent upon the next part. Because she wanted to believe that she belonged, Rosara ignored the fact that she was being treated as a servant. So this part that's in black, that's the independent clause. Another word for independent clause is a sentence. This is a complete sentence that could stand alone by itself. Rosaura ignored the fact that she was being treated as a servant. Done. Complete sentence. But if I want to add a little bit more to that, adding this dependent clause is a really nice way to do that. And because I started the sentence with a dependent clause, I must put a comma here between the dependent clause and the independent clause. Now, what if I put the independent clause first and then followed it by the dependent clause? Well, let's try that. I'm just going to cut and paste. Now I need to do some changes with punctuation. Because I started with my independent clause, I do not need a comma. And I'm making it all one sentence, so I need to make this a lowercase b. And since this is the end of my sentence here, I need to change it from a comma into a period. That still works. Rosaura ignored the fact that she was being treated as a servant because she wanted to believe that she belonged. I do not need a comma here because I started with the independent clause and I just have my period here. It's not a run-on, and I've made it a complex sentence in which I've communicated two ideas. I communicated the fact that she ignored how she was being treated and why she did so. So you can see here that including both an independent clause and a dependent clause in a single sentence is a great way to write more sophisticated sentences that communicate more than one idea, but you have to do it grammatically correct, which means if you start with the dependent clause, like I do here, you need a comma separating it from the independent part. However, if I flip it, and you can always flip it, it always works to put the dependent clause second. You don't need a comma here. You just continue right on with the dependent part and put your period at the end. Okay, now you are armed and ready with two new strategies to make your writing more sophisticated, to communicate two ideas in a single sentence, either by using dependent and independent clauses or by using appositives to add an explanation or more detail to something that you just discussed. Now, go into your own writing and see if you can find places where you can kick up your sophistication a notch by trying these two strategies. Good luck!